Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Hello, hello, how are you? Can you all hear me? If you can, let's use the chat room if you can, because then I can see you more easily. Okay, yes, yes. We have the questions and the chat. Okay, good, good. So you can hear me all right, that's excellent. So good afternoon, everybody. I'm Vinicius Nobre, but you can call me Vinny. And today we're going to talk a little bit about assessment. It's going to be kind of like an introduction to some theory behind assessment, and I'll be sharing with you some of the paradigm shifts that we're looking into when it comes to assessing learners. And I'll be asking you some questions, so feel free to participate and share with me how you feel and your experience and your opinions, all right? So the first thing that I believe we can do, I'm going to turn off my camera a little bit now. The first thing that I believe we can do is to take a quick look at some concepts behind, some concepts behind assessment. Whoops, my presentation is frozen. Okay, everybody can hear me. Hello, hello, good afternoon, everyone. Hello, hello. All right, so let me see what's going on. My presentation froze. Let me see if it's okay now. Can you see the PowerPoint presentation? Yes, okay, good. So let me turn off the camera. Let me see if this is gonna work now. Okay, you can hear me, but for some reason, my presentation is not running. So I'm just gonna talk you through. I'm very good at talking. So, oh yes, there we go. Okay, fine. So here I have 10 different concepts related to assessment, and I'm going to read them through to you. And I would like you to tell me what percentage you would say you feel comfortable about, okay, from these concepts. So I've got objective testing, I've got backwash effect, I've got proficiency, I've got criterion related testing, face validity, norm reference testing, integrative testing, subjective testing, assessment, reliability, and discrete point testing, and sorry, there's one more, content validity. If you look at these 10 items from 0 to 100%, how much would you say you feel confident when it comes to assessment? If you can type a little bit there, a number from 0 to 100%, I would be interested in learning a little bit about your 50%, okay. Have you heard these words before? Which ones do you feel confident about? Okay, 50%, wonderful, all right, not all of them, all right, about 40%, great. So we're going to have some new stuff here today. That's what I was hoping for. I really wanted to bring some news to you. Okay, I've never heard of any of them, that's great. Okay, okay, lovely, lovely. So I'm going to start talking a little bit about these concepts, and I'll be connecting them a little bit, all right? So let's start with assessment, okay, which is here. Let's start a little bit with assessment, which is the macro term. It's the title of this webinar. Assessment is a very, very macro concept, and it can take a lot of different shapes. When we think about assessment, many times because of our history, because of our habits, our traditions, we think of tests, right? We think a lot about testing students and formal tests and written tests. Luciana, you can answer there, okay? I can read it there, don't worry, it's absolutely fine. So one of the issues that I personally have when it comes to assessment is exactly the fact that we relate assessment to tests. I love assessment as a topic. I really like discussing it and talking about it. But one of the problems that I believe we have is the fact that we don't consider assessment a broader thing. We usually think of assessment as tests. And if you ask me, I think we should eliminate all sorts of tests. I think that one of the biggest problems that we have in education as a whole is the fact that we test students. And sometimes we're testing students, but we're not necessarily assessing them. Whereas when we assess students well, this can inform a lot of our decisions and we can do much more. So when we talk about assessment as a whole, is what we do every day when we look at a student, when we listen to a student, when we mark their homework, when we interact with them, we are constantly assessing them. We can have formal assessment and we can have informal assessment. But assessment is something that is very important. It's vital for our process of teaching and learning, whereas testing is not necessarily the same thing. So testing is one way of assessment. However, it's not the only way, and in my opinion, it's not even something that we should consider. And then you ask me, but then, Vinny, what is the alternative if we don't have tests? I think that we can look at other ways of assessment, other ways to analyze students' development and their needs that are less stressful, that are more valid, and we'll talk about validity in a second, and that can, impact their learning process in a more positive way. So assessment, one of the issues is that when we assess students, when we have tests, we naturally look at something that is called backwash effect, or as you will also find, washback effect. You're going to hear both, okay? You're going to hear backwash and washback effect using interchangeably. What is a backwash effect? Whenever you are assessing students and whenever you're testing students, the fact that this assessment or this kind of test exists will impact the teaching and the learning. So it goes back. There is an effect in what we do. Just think about the most popular tests that we have, or the most popular tests that we have in our big educational system, the vestibular and the Enem. If we didn't have any kind of vestibular or Enem, if they didn't even exist, we wouldn't be teaching the same things. A lot of the syllabus, a lot of the kind of exercises, a lot of the practice, a lot of the priorities that we set in our educational system, they all come from the fact that we need to prepare students for Enem and for vestibular. This is what we call a washback effect. If you want a very practical example, and if you want to see how we are all victims of a backwash effect, a perfect example is when you ask, what is going to be in the test so that I can prepare my students? Or when you look at the test and you know that there is a question on prepositions of place, so when you're teaching, you do a little more in that particular lesson of prepositions of place, or you tell your students, this is very important, pay attention. This is a very simple example of the backwash effect. However, the backwash effect or washback effect, it doesn't necessarily need to be a bad thing. Backwash effect is the effect that we suffer when we have a test, when we have a form of assessment in place. We can use it in our favor. We can have a positive backwash effect. How exactly, right? You might be wondering. If we want to change the way we teach, we can start by changing the way we assess. If you want the teaching to be more, let's say, interactive, the assessment will have to be more interactive. If you want the teaching to prepare students to deal with the unexpected and to be prepared to cope with whatever comes up, the test will have to be unexpected and something that comes up. If you want the teaching to be more communicative, to be more real life, then the test will have to be designed to be more communicative and more real life. However, there is sometimes a discrepancy. You have a course that claims to be very communicative, that says that they want to encourage a lot of interaction and a lot of speaking, but the most important form of assessment is a written test with multiple choice activities. What is the washback effect? Instead of getting students to speak, the teachers will probably get students to do multiple choice exercises that will focus on the grammar or the vocabulary or whatever it is that the test will focus on. So in this case, the washback effect is negative. But if you want to change the way we teach, we need to change the way we assess. What is another way that we can change this? By totally eliminating the tests from our life, right? If we don't have tests, for example, and we assess students continuously, that means that teachers will be much more relaxed, students will be much more relaxed, and you'll have a continuous type of assessment that will not necessarily impact the teaching in a negative way. So these are just some thoughts regarding backwash and washback effect. When we talk about assessment, there are two very important terms that I want to highlight, and they are reliability and validity. Here we have phase validity, and we also have content validity. And they are all related, content validity, phase validity, and reliability. They are all key features of assessment. Let me tell you a little bit about them, okay? Let's start with validity. A test is valid in the concept of assessment, in the theory behind assessment. A test is valid when it tests what it's supposed to test. What does that mean? For example, if you have a course that focuses on speaking, on conversation, fluency, and you give students a test that is a grammar test at the end of the course, this test is not valid because you are supposed to assess what the course wants to achieve. If the course wants to achieve speaking and fluency, for the assessment to be valid, it needs to be on speaking and fluency. If the course wants to prepare students to deal with the real life and the test is extremely artificial, the test or the assessment is not valid either. Phase validity and content validity are two specific types of this validity. Content validity is when the content of the test is different from what students were supposed to study of the test or the assessment. I'm using tests because that's what we usually see in courses, but it could be a portfolio, it could be continuous assessment. Content validity is when this assessment, whether it's a portfolio, whether it's a written test, is logical in terms of the content that you find in the assessment, with the criteria, with the focus, when it's aligned with what students saw. What is a common misconception, a common problem that we can face? We teach something and we test something else, right? So you spend the whole semester teaching a certain specific point, and then when you when you assess, when you test, the content of the test doesn't match what you taught. Then in this case, you don't really have content validity. What is phase validity? Phase validity is the overall credibility of a test. Is when people look at the test and they believe the test. They say, this test tests what it says that it tests. Let me give you an example of how content validity can be extremely important. If you have a proficiency test, right, for university purposes, for example. So universities, they want to check if students have a certain level of proficiency. So they have an international exam that they trust, and then they turn to students and they say, you have to do this test to get into the university, and you need to get, I don't know, 70%. You need to get a pass or whatever. If students do the test, what does the university expect? The university expects students to get to the university, and they should be able to speak, because that's what the test allegedly was going to check. If students do the test and they pass the test, if they get to university and they don't speak, the university, for instance, will look at the test and say, I don't trust this test anymore. So the test loses face validity. The credibility, the overall validity of that exam is lost. Tests that have a lot of face validity are tests that nobody can challenge. You say, well, if you have the certificate, I trust you speak English because it's from a very reputable, a very serious institution. So this means that it has a lot of face validity. What is then reliability, which is a term that is very connected in a way to validity? Reliability, a test is reliable when you do the test and the result of the test will be the same regardless of the variables. Let me give you an example. If I do a test and Peter marks my test, and then Mary marks the same test, and the results are different, the test is not reliable. So for example, a composition. If I write a composition and you don't really have a very clear set of criteria, and you don't really have a standardization process, any teacher can go there and mark my composition. That kind of assessment is not reliable, because maybe when you see my name, you say, oh, Vinny, I like Vinny, he's so nice. I'll give him instead of giving a 6, I'll give him a 7. And then the other teacher will look at the test and say, oh, I can't stand Vinny. He's a terrible student. He's really annoying. He could get a 6, but I'll give him a 5. So this test is not very reliable. What is a very reliable test, for example? Multiple choice. Multiple choice is an extremely reliable test because, you have an answer key. So much so that a computer could easily correct a multiple choice test. If you have if you shade, and you have a system in which you check the answer sheet, a computer can check it. You can give students the answer key. Even after the test, they can mark themselves and they know the grade. That's a very reliable test. What is the problem with a reliable test in English language teaching? If I'm teaching students to produce the language, to communicate, if the test is very reliable, very controlled, anyone who can mark it will get the same result, or actually anyone can mark it because it's very answer key-like, it's very closed. Does this test represent real communication? Or does this test represent knowledge of a certain item? If the test has a lot of reliability, it probably loses validity because it's not really testing what it says that it's testing. It's not really assessing what it's supposed to assess, which in our situation is effective communication, the ability to communicate in the language. Now, if the test is really valid, for instance, getting students to speak freely, they can use any resources that they have, they can use their body language, they can speak in the present, in the past, they can choose whatever they want to say, it's totally free, but it's real. And it's about effectiveness. Who's going to mark this? What criteria are you going to use to say if the student's a good communicator or not? People will probably have different opinions. So the assessment can be extremely valid, but then it loses reliability. So what often happens is that you can have more reliability, but at the expense of validity. If you increase validity, you probably lose reliability. So let's think of something that is really valid. Ongoing assessment for speaking in class. The teacher monitors students every class, and the teacher checks how well students are producing. And at the end of the semester, based on the production, the teacher will give students a grade. It's really valid, right? It's different situations. Students were relaxed. They had the opportunity to try again. Very flexible. It's more real life than an interview, for example. However, if I give one student an 8 and I give another student a 5, and students come to me and they say, but why did I get a 5 and why did I get an 8? It can be quite hard to explain. So that means that even though it's really valid, it's not that reliable. What is the key to success? What's the secret? Trying to strike a balance, finding ways to assess students in a way that validity is there, but the test also should also have a good amount of reliability. So the more communicative the test is, the more strategies we need to have to make sure that the criteria are extremely clear, to make sure that the assessors, the teachers, are all standardized, that the students know what they are being assessed on, and so on and so forth. So it is quite challenging, right, to design tests, because they need to be reliable, they need to have reliability, but they now also need to have validity. All right, let's move on to more specific features of assessment. So let's talk about 2 types of assessment: criterion related testing and norm referenced testing. These are 2 types of tests that we can have. If I tell you that vestibular is norm referenced, what does that mean? It means that you never really know what the average is going to be. We never really know what is a pass and what is a fail. Why? Because it depends on the performance that students have year after year. You need to correct all the students, and then you will understand what the average nota de corte is going to be. So you create a norm that you will refer to when marking students. And then you say, well, okay, that doesn't really impact my work, because where I work or the kind of assessment that I do, I have criteria. So I know what an 8 is supposed to be, what a 9 is supposed to be. So it's criterion related. Okay, fair enough. Maybe we think and we want to assess students following a criterion. But where does norm referenced as a concept, where does it come in? It comes in because at the back of our minds, we still look at the group of students that we have as the strong ones, the middle ones, and the weak ones. So when we are marking tests, we sometimes unconsciously manipulate the grades, because not all tests are 100% reliable. There is some room, some flexibility, because they are usually more open, right? So like a composition, for example, or speaking. So I sometimes unconsciously tend to privilege or to force the grades a little bit, because I believe that there should be a curve. There should be 20% of the students getting a certain higher grade, about 50% of the students will have somewhere in the middle, and about 30% will be the bottom. So it impacts our marking, the fact that we are so used to norm reference testing sometimes at schools, and definitely for vestibular, for example, that we might be influenced by this when marking something that sometimes should be based simply and only on the criteria. So we've covered all of them. So if the test has very objective kind of exercises and activities, if it's objective testing, chances are that this test will be more reliable because it is very objective, right? It's yes or no, right or wrong, A, B, or C. Whereas what opposes objective testing is subjective testing. And subjective testing has the challenge of being subjective, like an interview, a composition, and then in this case, I don't have a simple answer key. I can have criteria to follow, I can have standardization processes, but I don't have an answer key. How does that impact what we do? When we are designing a test, it's important to look at the count or an assessment tool, right? Because here you can have a subjective moment, for example, the speaking of the whole semester. And then you can have a more objective moment, which is a multiple choice test. If you have a combination of subjective assessment or testing and objective testing, you will increase the balance between validity and reliability. So if we only have subjective testing, if we only have the assessment based on, you know, free production, something more open, very subjective, that could potentially be based on your opinion, on a certain level of bias, you lose reliability. So what is an interesting strategy to compensate? Include some objective testing that can be cross-referenced with your subjective testing to see if there is consistency in the student's outcome and their performance. Now, two other points here: discrete point testing and integrative testing. Discrete point testing is when we go specifically for one item. For example, this is the question of the prepositions. So you have a whole exercise on prepositions. In the past, there was a very famous international test. Some of you might have taken the test, some of you might have prepared students for this test, where the whole test was entirely discrete point and very objective. What was the structure of this test? It was all multiple choice, top to bottom, multiple choice, multiple choice, multiple choice, and each question referred to a very clear language item. So you had one question for passive voice, one question for reported speech, one question for the use of pronouns. So when we prepared students for this test, and I was there because I'm an old gentleman with gray beard, so I prepared students for this international exam. As a teacher, it was delightful because, you know, you knew exactly what you had to cover. So you focused on passive voice and you taught students everything they needed to know about passive voice. Very discrete point. And it was very objective because it was multiple choice. What happened in the end? This test started losing validity because students memorized the rules. Students prepared for the test so much that they could regurgitate all the rules of the passive voice. They could say everything that they knew about the present perfect. The present perfect is an action that started in the past, but in real life, they couldn't socialize. They couldn't understand academic lectures. They couldn't write an assignment. And then the test lost credibility because students would pass with beautiful grades, but in real life, they blocked. So lost validity. What was the strategy to compensate for this? to change the objective testing and the discrete point testing into something more subjective and more integrated. What was integrated? This test lost the grammar part and integrated the grammar part into the listening and into the reading and into the writing. So students couldn't memorize the grammar rules because now their grammar knowledge, their ability to use the grammar is assessed when they have to understand what people say and when they have to communicate through writing or through speaking their ideas, which is much more real life. In real life, we don't go around telling people the rules about grammar. In real life, we talk to people and we are understood, or we understand what people say. So the test changed from multiple choice on reported speech, passive voice, etc., 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 into a test where students have to listen to something, read something, and then write their opinion about it. Or students have to read a text and they have to talk about their opinions or how they feel about that particular topic. The vocabulary, the grammar, the pronunciation, the discourse management, all of these features of language are then assessed by looking at the student's ability to really produce the language in an integrated way and not as discrete points. So if students don't necessarily know the passive voice as the passive voice, but they can successfully accomplish the task, they are more successful, they're more competent as speakers than somebody who can write a book about the passive voice, but who will freeze in front of a speaker or in the middle of a lesson. And last but not least, proficiency, which is the overall concept of students' ability to communicate, right? So when we assess students, we want to assess their proficiency in the language and not their formal knowledge of the rules, for example. So this is an important concept that we want to always bear in mind. So far, so good. I don't know if I have questions. I've addressed some of the concepts. Are you all there? Sometimes it can be very lonely giving webinars. Yes, 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 you're all there. Okay. Okay, so thank you. So let me see if I can move my slides. Yes, I can. Okay. Oops, I have to erase this. So when we assess, we can assess students for different reasons, for different purposes. We can assess students for placement purposes. We can place them in an existing course, for example. We can diagnose students, so we can take a look at what they need to develop and what their needs are. We can also assess to check their progress, so how much they've learned, how much they have developed, and to assess achievement over the entire course, at the end of the course. These different types of assessment can be classified into two different types of types of assessment, right? If you are assessing students to look forward, we are assessing students to inform our decisions as teachers, which we call formative assessment. In formative assessment, we look at the results from the students' assessment. So we can place them, we can diagnose them, and this kind of assessment informs what we're going to do. In summative assessment, we look back, we check how much students have developed, we check if we as teachers have achieved our objectives, and if students have achieved what they expect to achieve. Now, what is the challenge? What is the issue with summative and formative assessment? Many times you will hear people say, that this test is to be used as formative. This is beautiful, but the same test, the same piece of paper, or the same assessment, the same portfolio, the same interview can either be summative or formative depending only on your approach to the information that will come from there. What do I mean by that? In some situations, you can have a mid-term test, right? Students are doing a course. After 15 lessons, 10 lessons or whatever, you give them a test in the middle of a course and you call it some formative assessment. You say, oh, this is formative assessment to look forward. If you are following a book, a course book, if you have a program to follow that is predetermined, that is not going to be changed, and you're not going to change the way you teach with the results of the test, I'm sorry to tell you, but it's summative. It is not formative. Formative assessment needs to change the way you do things. It needs to inform you so that you can identify the gaps, you can identify the needs, and you can make decisions regarding the following steps and how you're going to design the lesson differently, design the second part of the course or the following level. So formative assessment really needs to inform you of something. It generates action. It doesn't simply inform you of the grade. That's summative, right? If you give students a midterm test, the fact that it's in the middle of the course doesn't automatically and miraculously turn the test into formative. It's still summative. You are checking students' progress for the first half of the course. So let's be honest, it's not formative, it is summative. So it's not when what's the difference between the third and the fourth? Oh, Christian, I'll tell you. When you are doing preparing a kind of assessment, you need to bear in mind that what you do with the information is much more important than when you are applying the test. Christian asked about checking progress and assessing achievement over the entire course. Checking progress can be this example that I mentioned. You can have a test in the middle of the course to check progress so far. You can have summative tests at the end of every lesson, like a summative task, for example, to see how students acquired that particular lesson objective. And to assess achievement over the entire course is what we call the final test, the end of term test. So that's the main difference between these. Christine, oh sorry, Christine, yes. I hope I answered your question. I hope it makes sense. So this is another important contrast that we need to bear in mind when we are thinking about the concepts behind testing and assessment. So I've said a lot. I've told you quite a lot about assessment. I'm going to give you 30 seconds to look at these characteristics regarding assessment. This is the last point of today. And I want to try and think whether these characteristics of assessment belong to an old paradigm of assessment or a new paradigm of assessment, okay? So take a quick look at these characteristics of assessment, if you may. Okay, you have focus on language, integrating skills, isolating skills, one answer, one-way correctness, learner-centered tests that also teach, emphasis on process, emphasis on product, open-ended multiple solutions, tests that test, teacher-centered, and focus on communication. Where would you place these features of assessment? Under old paradigm or new paradigm? Let's see. The old paradigm of assessment, or the theory of assessment, believes or would treat skills in isolation. You have a test, a moment for listening, a moment for speaking, and everything is separated. So it's you have a grammar section, for example, and a vocabulary section. This is old, okay? I'm sorry to break the news. If this is the kind of test that you're using, no problem, no hard feelings, but you need to know that you are following the old paradigm, okay? If you want to follow a new paradigm of teaching, you want to integrate the skills. You want to get students to, you want to assess the students' grammar through the listening, through the reading, through the writing. You want students to listen and then write something. You want communication to be more holistic, to be more organic. The old paradigm will focus on language then. Students' ability to use the passive voice, students' knowledge of the prepositions of place, students' knowledge of a list of vocabulary that they learned in class. This is old. The new paradigm focuses on communication, the student's ability to truly communicate an idea, regardless of the language items that they are using. You want them to use their entire language repertoire to assess their ability to communicate rather than their specific knowledge. Like a flipped class, not quite sure it's like flipped classroom, not really. In the old paradigm, the tests, they are teacher-centered. What does that mean? The teacher decides the test, the teacher decides when the test will happen, the kind of test, the teacher prepares the test. In the new paradigm, we're talking about a learner-centered kind of assessment. It's about the learners, what they need, what they want to know. They have more choice, they have more freedom. It's more about them than the teacher. It's more about them than us. In the old paradigm, the tests, they only test. You don't check your notes, you don't talk to anyone, you sit at your desk and you do it. In the new paradigm, the tests, they give you information about your performance while teaching you something new. So tests that also teach. After all, the whole purpose of teaching is to help people become better individuals and not to set traps and just evaluate and get students to be stressed and use this as a power bargaining moment. In the old paradigm, tests were more objective, they were more discrete point testing, they were one answer, one way correctness. It's letter B, it's letter E, it's true, it's false, and that's it. In the new paradigm, it gives us more work because it's open-ended, because we can have multiple solutions, because the teacher, when marking the test, will have to consider every possibility, and we'll see if the answer makes sense. Actually, there is no answer key. And the old paradigm, the emphasis is on the product. That test means everything. Whereas in the new paradigm, our emphasis is on the process, how the student has developed. We look at the starting point and how far the student has come. We look at the entire journey, the struggles, the obstacles. We look at the individual and what they have been able to achieve. So with this in mind, I'd like to invite you to think a little bit to yourself whether your view of assessment is more old paradigm, which is fine, but it's an old paradigm, and then we need to know it, or whether it's more new paradigm, or somewhere in between, because sometimes we can do something from the old paradigm, something the new paradigm. Sometimes our students expect an old paradigm. They ask us to give them a formal test with multiple choice. It's right or it's wrong, and they need that kind of sense of security, let's say. So there are different reasons to be leaning towards one or the other, but it's important to know that the tendency, the new trends towards assessment will focus much more on the process, on the learner, will be more open-ended, and will emphasize communication and not specific language points than the old paradigm. So this is a little bit of what I wanted to bring to you, some key concepts regarding assessment. I don't know if it was helpful. I would love some kind of feedback or questions that you might have. And I would like to invite all of you to follow us here at Troika. Our website is www.troikabr.com. And we have lots of courses, including courses on assessment too. And we would love to have you. We would love to see you here with us. So if you have any comment or reaction, I will be happy to hear. For one-to-one classes, what to suggest, since the student always speaks the same person, the teacher. I think that, you know, it's a good question. You can get students to record themselves. You can maybe invite students to work together for the purposes of assessment. I think that you can think of different strategies. Oh, thank you so much for the feedback, everyone. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Our website, sure, Albert, we are www.troikabr.com. We are also on Instagram as TroikaBR and Facebook too. So if you wanted to pay us a visit, we would be delighted to see you. We are also visiting Brazil and different places. It was a pleasure. Hey, Vivi, I'm glad you enjoyed it. Janiki, thank you. It's my pleasure to share a little bit of what I know, and you know, I hope we can stay in touch. If you want to send some feedback, you can also write to me. You can send me an email to Vinnie, V-I-N-N-I-E, @troikabr.com. Vinnie @troikabr.com. So if you want to say what you thought about the webinar, if you have suggestions, comments, or questions, please feel free. It's my pleasure to work with you. Thank you very, very much. Belém, I'm going to Belém tomorrow. I'm sorry, Miriam, I'll be there tomorrow. So thank you very much, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope to see you soon again. Thank you very, very much. Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye. Super thanks, everyone.